We can only imagine the Singapore of 2065. But we do know that by 2065, Singapore must be a very different place than it is today. In its second half-century, Singapore will face daunting challenges. A rapidly growing and aging population, a battle for economic survival, and accelerating climate change. How Singapore meets those challenges will decide its future. Today, our most innovative architects and urban planners are envisioning radical solutions that will transform the way we live. The Singapore of the future will be the city of our dreams. In part 1 of Futuropolis, we envisioned what Singapore would be like on its 100th birthday in the year 2065. Faced with the twin challenges of an expanding population and accelerating climate change, many of Singapore's most innovative planners and architects are convinced that the only way to meet these challenges will be to create a smart, sustainable, vertical city soaring hundreds of meters into the sky. Building up will be essential, but it may not be enough. By 2065, Singapore may have no more land to build on. The only other place to expand will be out to sea. And some think that's the future.
If the surface area of the world is 2/3 water, I think that's a very clear indication for Singapore that we could be exploiting the water as a means of further urbanization rather than just trying to urbanize in central locations. A bit of diversity doesn't hurt.
Architect, academic and author Jason Pomeroy founded Pomeroy Studio in 2012.
Aquaculture.
His idea for creating new living space: regenerate Singapore's old port areas with self-sustaining communities that would literally live on the water.
Could this actually be the new vision for
But how would a large urban population live on water?
Broadwalks that provide an opportunity for people.
Jason calls his solution the POG, or Pod Off Grid.
What we wanted to try and achieve was a self-sustaining community that could be floating on water that would also be generating its own energy source. A POG, or Pod Off Grid, is a series of self-sustaining pods that clip together, be that residential pods, working pods, hospitality pods, food and beverage, retail, so on and so forth, that can all be clipped together like a giant Lego kit of parts that can be floating dynamically on the water and completely self-sustaining.
But Jason foresees his POGs as being more than just living spaces. Just as the vertical city combines work and play areas, so will his floating city. He's convinced that future Singaporeans won't be just living in the sky, they'll also be living on the sea.
Think about it. This sort of expanse of water, what is it really being used for right now or in the future? Rather than trying to create more urban density, why don't we actually expand out onto the water? This central hub is effectively the central focus for the community. It has an amphitheatre, it has food and beverage, it has civic administrative functions. And from this central hub, we can then see its connection back to the mainland via the spine providing an ease of movement from the mainland out onto the water. But with that central hub, you also have the ability to live, work, and play on the water. What we can see is those towers providing a means of the Singaporean people living very close to the offices that they may be working in. We see the food and beverage and the hotels also floating on the water, being in synergy, if you will, with the Marina Bay Sands as a centre for tourism and leisure.
They're not just living spaces. This is an opportunity to create fully sustainable communities. The ability to create places that would allow you to live, work, and play in one area is very important to the sustainability of the city. By creating mixed-use developments that allow you to live, work, and play, you can walk to work, cycle to work. You can live and breathe and experience the city in its full glory.
Living on POGs in the sheltered waters of port areas could provide future Singaporeans with some of the new living space they'll desperately need. But could the idea of living on water be taken a step further? Could future Singaporeans actually live not just along the shores, but on the open sea?
When the waves come, how would this wave pass through this system of storage modules?
Engineering professor Wang Qianming thinks it's possible.
We like to study the rise of this water level, which they call it the piston effect.
He and his student team have been studying the effects of wave action on floating structures, exploring the possibility of living on offshore megafloats.
You know, our Earth is covered by 70% of ocean in terms of surface area. To me, it's a matter of time before our city will sprawl over onto the water. If you imagine yourself on land, your land is actually floating on, you have the huge plates underneath you. Actually, there's nothing really fixed. Everything is moving. But in the sea, of course, you can imagine if I cover the sea with a huge artificial land made of concrete or steel, and I'm talking about covering to the order of tens of kilometers by tens of kilometers, very, very huge area. It will appear to you just like normal land. In fact, when you stand on it, you won't even feel that you're on water.
Professor Ming imagines that by 2065, giant floating platforms known as VLFSs, or very large floating structures, could be anchored off Singapore's shores, providing artificial living space for a country running out of the real thing. But how would these floating communities fare in the open ocean? As it turns out, Singapore's equatorial location makes it a great place to experiment with offshore living.
First of all, the coastal waters of Singapore is so benign in terms of wave forces as well as wind forces. So it's very ideal for floating structures. In this particular spot, we can consider putting our floating golf courses as well as floating parks, and they'll be kilometers long.
Very large floating structures could help solve Singapore's future land crisis. But by the year 2065, another crisis could threaten Singapore. 90% of Singapore's food is imported. What would happen if someday those imports stopped coming? How would Singapore feed itself? As As it imagines itself in the year 2065, Singapore is confronting a series of challenges that could threaten its future. Architects and urban planners dream of cities in the sky and suburbs on the sea. Radical but possible ideas for creating new living space for an expanding urban population. But there's another looming threat that Singapore can't control. A future worldwide shortage of food. Climate change will mean more and more droughts and crop-destroying storms, while the world's population grows. Singapore imports 90% of its food. If there's not enough to eat worldwide, Singapore's food supply will be threatened.
Our food imports are highly dependent on the regions in which the food is grown, so that's one potential vulnerable point in Singapore. One of the features of future climate change is that there might be more intense and more frequent severe storms like typhoons. These tend to occur a lot in the Philippines as well as in Vietnam. There's going to be a lot of negative impacts there. There's also a possibility of more variable rainfall events. You could have more floods that occur because of intense rainfall. This will be extremely disruptive for agriculture, for instance.
At the moment, a huge amount of import is taking place in order to sustain the mouths of the Singaporeans and the people living on this small city-state.
Singapore needs to become more self-sufficient. But where in this urbanized island can Singaporeans grow their own food? Some envision future farmland on the sea. Jason Pomeroy believes his POGs could be an innovative way to grow more locally and import less. At Sky Green's vertical farms, he sees the future.
A vertical farm is very much the farm of the future, because with urbanization, the land prices are going to go up. So why use it for farming? Put the farms on the water. Create vertical floating farms. Vertical farming is basically taking some of the traditional methods of horizontal farming, but turning it 90 degrees. You're getting that even distribution of light to allow for the plants to grow by actually having them on this kind of rotating track. And what we're able to see here is that you're able to get still high densities of growth because it's actually reaching up for the sky, meaning that it does become far more efficient and less land guzzling.
Vertical farming not only saves land, but rotating the crop upward toward the sunlight and controlling the interior environment to deliver consistent temperature and humidity increases production by 50%. Using micro-sprinklers reduces water consumption by 70%.
Your conventional farm may be using 300 to 400 litres of water to grow a kilogram of root crop. Here what we have is an example where the kilogram of root crops would only need about 12 litres of water. So you're saving on water.
But farming on POGs won't begin to meet the needs of an expanding urban population. Only much bigger farms can do that. Could farming out at sea on very large floating structures be a solution? The Very Large Floating Structure is designed for coastal waters. Could VLFS farms survive on the open sea? Professor Wang Jianming believes they could, if they're built right.
The challenge is how to assemble very, very large floating units to make into a one monolithic structure of the order of tens of kilometers by tens of kilometers. The floating fuel storage will have to go into water depths of maybe about 50 to 150 meters. Obviously, you can't build it as one piece. You have to build in the smaller pieces. After building it, you float it out to site where they assemble. We'll create a wave, and the wave will hit these floating bodies. So you can see the response of the floating bodies due to a wave action. Another challenge is to really create a very economical mooring system to ensure that it's robust and be able to withstand the test of time, to hold the floating structure in position. In other words, holding the structure in a horizontal plane. But of course, this mooring system that you have will allow the floating structure to move up and down in the vertical direction to allow for different payloads as well as for different tidal variation. Here comes, look at how beautiful the wave is.
Right around here.
Yes. Oh, there you are.
That's why I want to put the model here.
Yes.
So it's right on this.
Yes, that's where the wave breaks here.
Okay.
I'm very optimistic that we could design floating structures that can last 100 years or even more.
Professor Ming doesn't see ocean waves as a threat to a very large floating structure. He's convinced a VLFS could provide its residents with a stable living platform.
If you have a floating structures of a mega size, your structure is so large that the wavelength that hits the floating structure is so small compared to the dimensions of the floating structure that it's like little ripples in a little pond. To give you a nice analogy, consider the fact that you are a little fly standing on the back of an elephant. Would the elephant know that you are on its back? So it is something like this. Places like the Maldives, Marshall Islands, and Solomon Islands, they all face the possible inundation by the rising water level in the ocean due to global climate change. So one possibility is perhaps we create a huge floating platform, creating a new country for them and housing all these people in these islands on this huge floating structure.
Housing people on the sea is closer to reality than we might think. Made up of over 100 islands and fearing rising sea levels, the South Pacific territory of French Polynesia has recently commissioned California's Seasteading Institute to develop a concept for a permanent floating community at sea.
One of my ideas is perhaps create a floating prison out in the middle of the ocean where you can put the most wanted criminals or terrorists there. And it would be a great place that to house them in. I don't think there's any way of escape if you have a floating structure right in the middle of a Pacific Ocean.
But climate change isn't only threatening land-grown food. Rising sea temperatures are also having a devastating effect on fish stocks. In 2015, off Singapore's coast, a plankton bloom, in part triggered by a rise in sea temperature, killed a massive number of fish. Could future fish farms on board very large floating structures help feed the nation? Professor Ming believes they could.
We can have very large floating fish farms, such as the one we are now standing on. But we can have much, much bigger and more advanced type of design, incorporating latest technology to create a greater production of fish than ever before. With these fish farms, I believe that if given sufficient space, we can enlarge as big as you want. We just have to maintain quality of the fish in terms of oxygen level and also supplying them with appropriate food. So if we have all that in place, we can have a very, very mega fish farm.
Highly stable and versatile, very large floating structures could assist with farming food. But food isn't the only thing essential to life that will soon be threatened by an increasing population. There's also water. Singapore is a small island with no natural aquifers or lakes, so it will be particularly vulnerable. Its future depends on guaranteeing a supply of clean, drinkable water. And that won't be easy.
So if you compare us to New York, Tokyo, Bangkok, those cities have a huge hinterland from which they get their source of water supply. Singapore is so small that we don't have enough land area to collect and store the rainwater that falls onto the island.
To overcome that handicap, Singapore created an artificial hinterland by reaching agreement with its neighbour, Malaysia, to draw up to 946 million litres per day from the Johor River. But that agreement is due to expire in 2061. And with its population steadily increasing, Singapore needs greater sufficiency in its water supply. To achieve that, Singapore has already come up with innovative solutions. It's constructed the Marina Barrage, a dam at the confluence of 5 rivers and the sea. It created a massive freshwater reservoir in the heart of the city, while an innovative new water system filters wastewater through a fine polymer membrane to remove impurities, creating purified water that is ultra-clean and safe to drink. But the nation currently consumes 1.9 million cubic meters of water a day. And by 2060, that number's projected to double. Working to meet that projection, Singapore's National Water Agency, the Public Utilities Board, or PUB, has built 5 new water plants and 2 desalination plants, with another 3 in the pipeline. 2/3 of Singapore's land area is engineered for water catchment. Water that falls there is channeled into 17 reservoirs. The ultimate goal is to cover 90% of the nation. And Professor Wang Chengming has a radical idea that might make the national water supply even bigger.
I was thinking that perhaps in our reservoir, we can have a 2-tier reservoir where we use lightweight concrete tanks, elevate above the water level of the reservoir to collect the rainwater, and so increasing the capacity of our reservoir. These tanks could be made into the shape of like kind of inverted mushrooms.
Professor Wang's idea could help increase Singapore's water supply, along with new water and desalination. But these systems have a vulnerability. They are dependent on energy. Energy will become more and more precious and expensive as the world's fossil fuel supply declines. Singapore must find new and innovative forms of energy to power its future. By 2065, the worldwide decline in fossil fuel supplies will have had a dramatic impact on Singapore's resources. They will be in short supply, none more so than energy. Today, Singapore is committed to getting 80% of its electricity from renewable or low-carbon sources by 2050. But fossil fuel still generates 70% of Singapore's electricity production. Finding new and sustainable energy sources to keep fueling the nation will be another challenge to future survival. PUB is trialling solar panels on its reservoirs to gather energy from the sun and generate power. But they won't supply anywhere near what Singapore needs. Rank upon rank of solar panels was the obvious answer. But where could land-starved Singapore build a giant solar farm? Could the ever-versatile, very large floating structure again come to Singapore's aid?
floating structures being out there in the sea, we can put solar farms. There'll be no shadows on our floating structures because it's way out the sea, so there'll be no interruption. And we can use the seawater to cool our photovoltaic panels to make it greater in terms of its efficiency.
The very large floating structure could do more than turn sunlight into energy. There's more wind out at sea. Very large floating turbines could be deployed to harness that energy. And the sea itself could be harnessed as a source of energy.
There's a lot of research now working on towards how we could use tidal variation, water currents, and even waves to generate power for our new world. Also, whenever you have islands where they're separated by straits or narrow channels, the currents are very strong. What we can do is we can attach turbines beneath our floating structure so that the water current will spin these turbines and generate electricity.
The local impact of climate change on Singapore's resources isn't the only threat to its future. The disastrous effects of climate change far from Singapore's shores will strike at the nation's economic heart. Today, Singapore is the world's second largest commercial port. Thousands of ships drop anchor in the harbour, bringing goods to and from 600 other ports in 123 countries spread over 6 continents. And soon, the port of Singapore will be even busier. By 2027, all of Singapore's current ports will be combined into a single megaport at Tuas on Singapore's west coast. The new Tuas port will load and unload 65 million shipping containers a year. But this key economic asset will soon be under threat.
Climate change will have a very significant impact on sea ice in the Arctic. Some projections say that by 2065, the Arctic could be ice-free in the summer. Some more pessimistic scenarios state that it could be ice-free as early as 2050, if not sooner.
The opening up of the waters north of Siberia will cut a third off the distance ships will need to travel between northwest Europe and the Far East. This shorter, faster, cheaper route will bypass the shortest shipping route since ancient times, the Straits of Malacca. For 7 centuries, Singapore's built its prosperity as a shipping hub on its strategic location in those straits. But thanks to the Arctic ice cap melting, by 2065, Singapore's sea trade may have dramatically declined. Thousands of ships may no longer anchor off Singapore's shores. It seems incredible that a key element of Singapore's seemingly robust economy could be vulnerable to environmental changes in the Arctic. But Singapore's architects need to factor in the very real possibility that sometime in the future, Tuas Megaport may need to be reinvented. Professor Joseph Lim studies architecture and urban design.
See, the spine is a giant green roof that had huge urban spaces that were shaded, much like versions of the base of the Eiffel Tower.
He believes that designing Singapore's key urban projects to have only one purpose is unsustainable in a rapidly changing world.
And if we kept the spine building free and located the buildings onto smaller footprints, so then the open green roof would be the cooling surface. Yeah.
His think tank explores how existing infrastructure projects could be retrofitted for another purpose, if changing environmental or economic conditions make them obsolete.
I think this whole issue of never designing only for one condition, for one economic threshold of activity is important for the survival of future cities.
Interspersing all the residential spaces with the business spaces allow a different cross flow of mobility.
Underneath the infrastructure spine, we have huge arches which allows ships, transportation networks to pass through.
We need to design them in such a way that they are able to morph into different layouts with one skeleton. So back to this part, there would be a mixed-use plate about 200 meters wide. The full length of the pier is 4 kilometers. I think that this is a sound safety procedure to project for the future. How we could then, in a fleet-footed way, adapt to changing conditions rather than be locked in one structure. People and commuters move through the upper deck, they're able to see from an elevated skyline the large mega floats in the housing estates.
By designing infrastructure that can adapt to changing times, Professor Lim's aiming to ensure the long-term viability of Singapore's economy. His team is currently brainstorming how to repurpose Tuas Megaport.
I think here the idea that the port can be used for more than a single purpose becomes very important. To provide that initial structure to allow that change in future is crucial when we start to plan very large structural entities.
But Tuas's initial structure has been designed around 4 massive piers, separated by water to allow for the movement of shipping. How do you retrofit this land and water footprint to get alternative use?
So then, if you like, you had a float-away port.
This becomes like a new model of Singapore living.
Yeah.
Professor Joseph and his team elect to deploy a massive framework over the piers to repurpose areas for residential use, featuring transport systems and services. The open and ventilated framework will create a cool atrium beneath, reducing energy use for air conditioning. Mega floats will support residential, commercial and recreational areas. What was once a massive container port will be transformed into a small green city.
I think Tuas needs to be fully adaptable to changes in use, and large tracts of land should not be locked into purely a particular kind of port activity or infrastructure.
But just designing a multi-use facility at Tuas won't be enough to recover the revenue Singapore will lose if climate change reduces Singapore's shipping trade. By 2065, urban overpopulation will be threatening the whole world. And a record number of Singaporeans will be elderly and no longer working. To support its aging and growing population to 2065 and beyond, Singapore will need to develop new industries. Singapore's location on world shipping routes has made it one of the world's great trading hubs. And yet by the year 2065, climate change may very well have severely damaged Singapore's geographical trading advantage. But there's another great advantage to being located on the equator. An advantage a future Singapore could exploit, if it can pioneer future trading routes in space. By the year 2065, Singapore's role as a major shipping port may well have declined, and Singapore's economy may have suffered a major blow. Unless Singapore can find a way to stay in business as a global trading and transport hub. The good news is, some of Singapore's most visionary thinkers are working on a plan. A very ambitious one. Mathematician, physicist and computer engineer Lim Seng is trying to use a hot air balloon to send a Singaporean astronaut 20 kilometers above the Earth to the very edge of space. is hoping to spark a new vision of Singapore's future possibilities and to vindicate his belief that Singapore's economic future lies beyond the clouds.
What we try to do is to look for a niche. So I think it's within our capability. Just like launching a first Singaporean to space using stratospheric balloon, I think it is something that we can do. First, you really must believe in it. It happens that I really believe in it. I believe in it enough to quit my good job to do this. What we lack is people who dare to take the risk, cross the line, make mistake, crash the plane, do again, and continue.
Lim Seng believes Singapore's location on the equator will give it a competitive edge and enable it to develop a viable space industry.
Singapore being on the equator has the advantage of making use of the whole full swing of the momentum of the rotation of Earth to swing the spacecraft into orbit with less energy.
As the Earth rotates on its axis, each point on the Earth takes 24 hours to complete its rotation. Because the Earth is round and the widest point is at the equator, it means that the land is moving faster at the equator than any other place on the surface of the Earth. A rocket launched from the equator can take full advantage of this extra speed to generate more thrust, so it can carry less fuel and a bigger payload. Lim Seng is not alone in foreseeing the opportunities space offers Singapore. Singapore's Office of Space Technology and Industry is exploring the commercial possibilities of space.
Look at the pace of technological advancement. Your handphone is today more powerful than all of NASA's supercomputer in 1969. Launch costs continue to decline. We believe that space is now accessible to all nations, including Singapore.
And it is. Singapore has already designed, built and launched a series of satellites, but not standard-sized satellites. Singapore has taken advantage of global technological advancements in shrinking satellites to create miniaturized nano-satellites.
That's the big advantage for Singapore. We have now been able to shrink a satellite from the size of this room to something that's a fridge, and still make it as powerful and as useful as what used to occupy the whole room.
Who on Earth or in Singapore have imagined that we are building satellite in Singapore? Why not take up the challenge, right?
Lim Wee Seng heads Nanyang Technological University's Satellite Research Center.
Right now, we have actually in the beginning stage. We are pretty young.
The Satellite Research Center is pioneering Singapore's fledgling space industry by building and launching nano-satellites.
We actually go through, just like what the industrial space industry too, go through all the tests, vibration, the shock, the temperature, the vacuum test, and finally go to the launch hole and launch up to space.
Each satellite takes several years to design and build.
The satellite what we have right now is more on the low Earth orbits. I mean, somewhere about 400, 500 kilometers, or maybe as high 800 kilometers. So those are space that is more comfortable for us.
Launched into space on board a rocket from either India, Russia or Japan, Nanyang Technological University's satellites carry out various tasks from inter-satellite communications to remote sensing and imaging.
We actually measure the temperature, humidity, and pressure when we're going around. So we're able to monitor, so every week, every month, what's the changes like for the whole year and year after year.
Our industry today is also vibrant with over 30 companies. Space brings many benefits to society in Asia, in Singapore. Natural disaster coordination, detection of forest fires, crop protection and yield improvement. These are just some examples.
Sending satellites into space is certainly forward-thinking. But Singapore's space visionaries are already thinking way ahead of that. To them, space is a rich resource for growing Singapore's future economy. For space entrepreneur Lim Seng, it's a perpetual generator of sustainable energy.
When you have solar panel on Earth, you are limited by the sunlight, the hours of sunlight, 7 hours, 6 hours. And then the idea, therefore, is to bring this solar panel into space and point it to the sun for 724. So you will have sunlight all the time. And the idea is to then convert this solar energy in space into laser or microwave and bring back to Earth and change it back to electricity.
In Lim Seng's mind, by the year 2065, Singapore may have ended or reduced its dependence on fossil fuels by launching banks of solar panels into space. And Singapore's vision of its future in space doesn't stop there. By 2065, Singaporeans could be flying into space.
The space plane is a powerful aircraft that brings passengers to the edge of space, about 100 kilometers above Earth. Many companies, including Virgin Galactic and Reaction Engines, are working very hard to make that a reality. I believe that it is still early days, but I'm sure the space plane will bring about opportunities for Singapore's tourism and transportation industries.
If Singapore take the initiative to invest in such a technology, to be one of the game player, and if we are aggressive enough, if we are hungry enough, if we are entrepreneurial enough, we could be one of the 2 or 3 spaceports in the world.
There's only one problem. Round-trip travel in a space vehicle is very expensive. But in theory, there is a way to lower that cost by building a gigantic link between Earth and space. A space elevator.
It's really a crazy idea, okay? Whereby you have a tethered cable and the Earth is spinning and you tie to a station that is even further than the geostationary satellite. That's to say, beyond 36,000 kilometers. And then everything should swing accordingly. On paper, it looks good.
From a platform anchored in the ocean somewhere along the equator, a tether of thick cable with a counterweight at its end would extend 100,000 kilometers above the Earth. A giant cable might be held taut and stationary by the pull of gravity at the lower end and the opposing pull of centrifugal force at the upper end. Elevator cars could travel up and down that cable, delivering cargo and people into space. Singapore's space industry is in its infancy. Some of its visions might seem more sci-fi than science. But in this country, impossible dreams have a way of coming true. "200 years ago, Stamford Raffles stood on the banks of a remote Southeast Asian river and imagined a prosperous city, a wealthy global trading port, and a world-leading center of learning and research. By Singapore's 50th birthday, that dream had come to pass. Now, our most innovative minds are imagining what Singapore will be on its 100th birthday. And the drive to succeed that made Singapore what it is today must persevere to make Singapore what it must become.